Picture this. You're standing in the mists of what we now call Alaska around 1400 after Christ. The world is colder, wilder, more dangerous than anything we can imagine today. And out of those northern mists, like something from a dream or a nightmare depending on your perspective, emerge bands of hunters. Ghostly figures moving south through mountain passes that most of us couldn't navigate with GPS and modern gear. These weren't just random wanderers. These were the Athabaskan-speaking peoples, and they were about to change the entire Southwest in ways that would echo through 5 centuries of conflict, survival, and transformation. Think about that timeline for a moment. 500 years. That's longer than Europeans have been continuously present in North America. Now here's where it gets fascinating. As these northern peoples moved south, they didn't stay together as one massive tribe. Instead, they split apart like a river hitting rocks, each group adapting to different landscapes, different challenges, different opportunities. The Chiricahua claimed the Dragon Tooth Mountains of what we call Arizona today. And when I say Dragon Tooth, I mean it. These are peaks so jagged and forbidding, they look like they were designed by nature to keep people out. The Mescalero settled among the sacred peaks of New Mexico, while the Jicarilla and Western Apache bands spread across territories so vast that a modern road trip across their lands would take you days of driving. We're talking about an area larger than many European countries, controlled not by massive armies or fortified cities, but by relatively small, incredibly mobile groups of people who understood something that most civilizations never figured out. Sometimes the best way to hold territory is to never try to hold it at all. And here's what made these people so different from the Pueblo peoples they encountered when they arrived in the Southwest. The Pueblo had built permanent settlements, beautiful adobe structures that still stand today, communities rooted to specific locations. But these Apache newcomers? They built wickiups, structures that rose like mushrooms after rain and could vanish just as quickly as morning mist. This wasn't primitive architecture, folks. This was genius adaptation. A wickiup could be constructed in hours, using materials found almost anywhere in their territory. More importantly, it could be abandoned without a second thought when circumstances demanded mobility. Try doing that with a Pueblo or a European castle. Now, who owned these homes? Here's where Apache society shows us something that would have shocked most European observers of the time. Women owned the wickiups. Women owned the precious burden baskets that held a family's entire world. Think about what that means. In a society where everything you owned had to be portable, where your entire material culture had to fit in containers you could carry, the people who controlled those containers controlled the household economy. Meanwhile, the men were perfecting weapons that would terrorize enemies for centuries. These recurved bows weren't toys. We're talking about weapons that could drive arrows through Spanish armor at 50 paces. Spanish armor, mind you, that was designed to stop crossbow bolts and sword thrusts. An Apache archer with a well-made bow was essentially carrying a medieval armor-piercing weapon. By 1540, when Coronado's expedition stumbled into Apache territory, and I use the word stumbled deliberately because these Spanish conquistadors had no idea what they were walking into. They encountered something that challenged every assumption they had about indigenous peoples. These Apache warriors could run 70 miles without stopping. 70 miles. That's nearly 3 marathons back to back. When water ran scarce in the desert, and it runs scarce a lot in that country, they drank cactus juice. They knew 400 different uses for the agave plant. 400. Most of us struggle to think of 4 uses for any single plant. The Spanish called them Apache, the enemy. But they called themselves Ndi, Inde, or Dine, all meaning simply the people. There's something profound in that difference, isn't there? To the Spanish, they were defined by opposition, by conflict. To themselves, they were simply human beings, the fundamental reality around which everything else revolved. But what really held this world together weren't weapons or wickiups, or even their incredible physical capabilities. What bound the Apache world together were sacred rituals so complex and beautiful, they'd make your head spin. The mountain spirit dancers who connected earth to sky in ceremonies that could last for days. The puberty ceremony where white-painted woman, one of the most important figures in Apache cosmology, entered young girls for 4 days, transforming them into vessels of supernatural power. These weren't casual weekend events, folks. These ceremonies required specific sacred items that had to be gathered from across enormous distances. Turquoise from mines that might be hundreds of miles away. Eagle feathers that could only be earned through patience and spiritual preparation that might take years. Pollen from plants that bloomed only after summer rains and only in certain locations. What this meant in practical terms was that the Apache developed trade networks that spanned from Mexico to the Great Plains. We're talking about economic relationships that covered more territory than the Roman Empire at its height, all maintained without written records, without permanent cities, without the massive bureaucratic apparatus that other civilizations required. Before we dive back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By the time the Spanish were trying to figure out how to deal with these people, the Apache had already created something unprecedented in human history. A civilization built on motion, an empire without monuments, a culture that could appear anywhere and vanish everywhere, leaving behind only the memory of their passage and the knowledge that they could return at any moment. And they were about to teach the colonial powers of North America a lesson that would take centuries to learn. Some peoples cannot be conquered because they refuse to be found in the same place twice. Tomorrow, we'll see how this philosophy of motion became the foundation of an empire that would make European kingdoms tremble with fear. Between 1650 and 1840, the Apache accomplished something that should be impossible according to every textbook on civilization you've ever read. They built an empire without cities. They created a civilization without monuments. They ruled through mobility and fear across territories larger than European kingdoms. And they did it all while remaining essentially invisible to anyone who wasn't supposed to see them. Let me put this in perspective for you. We're talking about nearly 200 years longer than the United States has existed as a nation, during which Apache bands maintained control over an area that stretched from what we now call Colorado down into central Mexico. That's roughly the size of Western Europe, controlled not by massive standing armies or elaborate fortifications, but by groups that rarely numbered more than a few hundred people. The game changer, Spanish horses. Now, the Spanish brought horses to the New World thinking they'd maintain a permanent military advantage. What they didn't count on was how quickly indigenous peoples would not only master horsemanship, but actually become better at it than Europeans who had been riding for centuries. By 1700, Apache cavalry units, and yes, I'm calling them cavalry because that's exactly what they were, could strike haciendas 500 miles apart within a single moon cycle. Think about the logistics of that. These weren't random raids. This was coordinated military action across distances that would challenge modern motorized units. Their economic system operated on what I can only describe as calculated terror. Mexican settlements from Sonora to Chihuahua paid regular tribute. Cattle, grain, manufactured goods, silver, to avoid complete destruction. This wasn't extortion in the crude sense. This was a sophisticated protection racket that generated steady income, while avoiding the costs and risks of constant warfare. One Apache warrior, and this quote has stuck with me for years, boasted that he knew the location of every water source between the Gila River and the Sierra Madre. Every water source. In a desert environment, that knowledge was literally worth more than gold. Men died of thirst within sight of hidden springs that only Apache scouts could find. But here's what really gets me about Apache society during this period. While the men were perfecting the art of warfare, The women were developing preservation techniques that turned desert survival into high art. They ground mesquite beans into sweet flour that lasted for years without spoiling. They dried strips of mule deer into pemmican, so light it was practically weightless, so nutritious it could sustain a warrior for weeks. And those baskets, Apache women wove baskets so tightly pitched they could hold water for weeks without a drop leaking out. No glue, no sealant, just plant fibers woven with such precision that they became waterproof containers. Try replicating that with modern materials and techniques. I guarantee you'll fail, the great Chief Mangas Coloradas. And when I say great, I mean this literally. The man stood 6 feet 4 inches tall in an era when the average height was maybe 5'6". He was a giant among men, and he knew how to use that presence. Mangas Coloradas understood something that most military leaders never figure out. Unity through diplomacy works better than unity through conquest. He united Apache bands not by defeating them in battle, but through strategic marriages, shared ceremonies, and intelligence networks that tracked every movement across Apache territory. His warriors perfected what military historians now call the false retreat. They'd engage Mexican armies in what appeared to be straightforward combat, then suddenly break and run. The Mexicans, thinking they had the Apache on the run, would pursue them into box canyons, where carefully positioned rocks could be triggered to create avalanches. The pursued became the buried. Meanwhile, Apache medicine singers were memorizing 10,000 verses of ceremonial songs that took 4 nights to perform completely. 4 nights. That's roughly 40 hours of continuous singing, every word memorized, every inflection preserved across generations without any written records. These songs contained histories, astronomical knowledge, healing practices, and spiritual wisdom that held Apache society together across vast distances. Their trading relationships shifted like desert sands, and this is crucial to understand their success. Sometimes, Apache bands would arrive at Comanche camps as trading partners, bringing buffalo robes south in exchange for horses and manufactured goods. 6 months later, those same Apache might raid those same Comanche camps, taking back the horses they'd traded for, and more besides. This wasn't treachery in the way Europeans understood it. This was strategy. By maintaining multiple relationships with every neighboring group, sometimes peaceful, sometimes hostile, always unpredictable, the Apache kept all their enemies off balance. No one could ever be certain whether an approaching Apache band came in peace or war until the moment of contact. By 1800, Spanish colonial officials estimated that Apache raids were taking 30,000 head of livestock annually from Mexican settlements. 30,000 animals. That's an entire regional economy flowing north into Apache territory every single year. Yet Apache bands remained small enough, mobile enough, invisible enough to vanish into landscapes that swallowed entire armies without a trace. And before we dive back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But this golden age of Apache independence was about to end. The year 1849 would bring American gold seekers flooding through Apache passes like a human avalanche, and with them would come 4 decades of warfare so brutal, so uncompromising, that it would break the free-ranging life. Forever, the collision between Apache mobility and American expansion was about to create some of the most legendary and tragic figures in the history of the American West, and tomorrow we'll meet the men and women who turned that tragedy into the final, desperate flowering of Apache resistance. The year 1849 changed everything. Gold seekers came flooding through Apache passes like locusts, bringing with them diseases, disruption, and a level of environmental destruction that the Apache had never encountered. But more importantly, they brought American military power, and American military power operated by completely different rules than anything the Apache had faced before. The Mexicans, for all their brutality, had been willing to coexist with Apache independence as long as the tribute flowed and the raids stayed within acceptable limits. Americans believed in something the Apache couldn't initially comprehend. Total war aimed at complete elimination of the enemy's way of life. What followed were 4 decades of apocalyptic warfare that would break the free-ranging life forever. And it began with an act of treachery so profound that it created blood debts that would never be settled. The year 1863, the murder of Mangas Coloradas. Now, I've studied a lot of military betrayals throughout history, but this one still makes my blood boil. Here was a man who had come to negotiate, under a flag of truce, the universal symbol of diplomatic immunity that had been recognized by civilized nations for centuries. American soldiers tortured him with heated bayonets. Heated bayonets? They held steel blades in campfires until they glowed red, then pressed them against the flesh of a man who had come to talk peace. When Mangas Coloradas finally died, shot while trying to escape, according to the official report, they cut off his head and boiled it clean so they could sell his skull to a phrenologist back east. His son-in-law was Cochise, and Cochise declared war on all Americans. For the next decade, southeastern Arizona became what one contemporary called a graveyard, where mail riders found their predecessors' bones scattered along desert routes. Cochise turned a territory larger than most European countries into a zone where American travel became essentially impossible without massive military escort. But the real horror came in 1871 with the Camp Grant massacre. Picture this: Apache families, mostly women and children, sleeping peacefully under the protection of the United States Army. They'd surrendered. They'd agreed to live under American authority. They were, by any definition, non-combatants under military protection. A mob of Tucson citizens, Mexican nationals, and Tohono O'odham warriors attacked the sleeping camp at dawn. They clubbed Apache women and children to death with axes and clubs. They scalped the dead and took the scalps to Mexican markets where they sold them for silver pesos. The Mexican government was still paying bounties for Apache scalps. Even from women and children, 108 people died. 104 of them were women and children. Only 8 of the victims were adult men. President Grant was so horrified when he learned the details that he threatened to place Arizona under martial law. But the damage was done. The message was clear. There would be no safety, no sanctuary, no protection for Apache people anywhere in American territory. Enter Victorio. If you want to understand Apache tactical brilliance at its absolute peak, you study Victorio's War from 1879 to 1880. This man commanded a band of exactly 80, warriors 80, and for over a year they killed more than 300 American soldiers and civilians, while being pursued by 3,000 troops across 2 nations. 3,000 troops chasing 80 warriors. That's a ratio of nearly 40 to 1, and the Apache were winning. Victorio's sister Lozan rode with the warriors, and here's where Apache spirituality becomes military strategy. Lozan possessed what her people believed was supernatural power. She could detect enemies by holding her palms up during sacred ceremonies and feeling tingling sensations that told her which direction danger lay. Whether you believe in supernatural power or not, the practical result was that Victorio's band almost never walked into ambushes. The Americans finally brought in General George Crook, who understood that you cannot fight Apache with conventional military tactics. Crook did something that divided Apache society in ways that are still felt today. He employed Apache scouts against their own people. Imagine that moral complexity. Apache men who knew every trail, every water source, every hiding place, hunting their own relatives through landscapes they'd known since childhood. Brothers hunting brothers through familiar mountains. The psychological warfare was as devastating as any physical battle, but the name everyone remembers is Geronimo. And Geronimo's final campaign demonstrates both the incredible courage of Apache resistance and the ultimate futility of fighting the industrial might of late 19th century America. 38 people. That was Geronimo's entire band by the end. 38 men, women, and children being hunted by 5,000 American troops and 3,000 Mexican soldiers. 8,000 soldiers pursuing 38 people. This pursuit lasted over a year and cost the American government more than $1 million. To put that in perspective, that was 40 times the annual budget of the entire Apache reservation system. The United States was spending more money hunting 38 Apache than it spent maintaining thousands of reservation residents. The photograph of Geronimo's surrender shows you everything you need to know about what that final year cost. These are hollow-eyed people who had eaten their horses when the game ran out, who had eaten their moccasins when the horses were gone, who had finally subsisted on rats and roots and whatever they could find in the desert that could keep them alive one more day. Before we dive back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. September 4th, 1886. Geronimo surrendered to General Nelson Miles at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona. The last of the free Apache had been run to ground. But here's what gets me about this moment, and this is where the tragedy becomes almost unbearable. In the prison camps that followed, Apache women who had gathered 200 different species of wild foods for thousands of years wept as they tasted army bacon, the salt of that processed meat mixing with tears for a world that could never return. 200 species of wild foods. These women were essentially walking encyclopedias of botanical knowledge, masters of desert survival techniques that had sustained their people for centuries. And they were being fed military rations while their children were forbidden to speak their own language. But this isn't the end of the Apache story. Not even close. Because what the American government didn't understand, what no government has ever really understood, is that people who have survived by adapting to impossible circumstances don't simply disappear when you put them in impossible circumstances. They adapt again. Tomorrow we'll see how the Apache transformed defeat into survival, how they carried the burden baskets of their ancestors into a modern world, and how the people who once made empires tremble found new ways to ensure their children would inherit tomorrow. The decades after 1890 brought something that was designed to be the final solution to what the American government called the Indian problem. It was systematic cultural genocide, and it was implemented with the same industrial efficiency that America brought to steel, production and railroad construction. Apache. Children were kidnapped, and I use that word deliberately because that's exactly what it was, and shipped off to places like the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania. There, speaking their native language meant solitary confinement. Practicing traditional ceremonies could get you shipped to Alcatraz Island, where Apache prisoners were held in cells that had once confined Civil War deserters. The motto of these schools was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Think about that for a moment. The explicit goal was cultural extinction. They weren't just trying to defeat Apache resistance, they were trying to erase Apache identity from human memory. But here's what the architects of cultural genocide never understood. Apache adaptation strategies had been honed through centuries of survival against impossible odds. They'd survived the Spanish Empire, the Mexican Republic, and the initial wave of American expansion. Now they would adapt to survive cultural warfare. And they did it in ways that nobody saw coming. World War I arrived, and with it came something unexpected. Apache men volunteering for military service in numbers that shocked federal officials. These were the sons and grandsons of warriors who had fought against the American army just 30 years earlier, and they were volunteering to fight for America. Why? Because military service came with citizenship rights that were denied to reservation residents. Apache veterans returned home with legal protections, federal benefits, and most importantly, organizational experience from the most efficient bureaucracy in the world, the United States military. World War II brought even more dramatic changes. Apache soldiers served in both theaters, but it was in the Pacific where they made their most significant contribution. Apache code talkers created communication systems that Japanese cryptographers never managed to break. The same linguistic complexity that had once hidden Apache war plans from Spanish. Colonizers now protected American military secrets from Axis intelligence, but the real breakthrough came in 1934 with the Indian Reorganization Act. Now, most people see this as a federal law that allowed limited tribal self-government. Shrewd Apache leaders saw it as something else entirely, legal cover for increasing autonomy. They began incorporating traditional governance structures into federally recognized governments. Council meetings that looked like standard municipal business to outside observers actually followed ancient protocols for reaching consensus. Legal documents written in English contained concepts that could only be fully understood in Apache languages. By 1970, something remarkable was happening. A cultural renaissance began as elders who had hidden traditional knowledge for 60 years started teaching publicly again. The generation that had been forbidden to speak. Apache in boarding schools began conducting those conversations with their grandchildren that had been interrupted by federal policy. Sunrise ceremonies returned to White Mountain. Crown dancers again connected earth to sky in public celebrations. Apache language programs fought desperately to save words that were literally on the edge of extinction, sometimes preserved in the memory of just one or two elderly speakers. Economic sovereignty came through paths that nobody had predicted. The discovery of natural resources on reservation lands provided revenue streams that funded cultural programs. Successful cattle operations drew on traditional Apache knowledge of rangeland management, knowledge that had been dismissed by federal agriculture agents but proved more sustainable than conventional ranching practices. Most dramatically, gaming compacts generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Apache nations went from being dependent on federal appropriations to being major employers in their regions. The people who had once survived by raiding Mexican haciendas were now running businesses that employed thousands of non-Apache workers. The Fort Apache Timber Company became one of the most sustainable logging operations in America by employing forest management principles that had been practiced for centuries before European contact. While environmental groups fought clear-cut logging on public lands, Apache forestry was being studied by universities as a model of ecological sustainability. Before we dive back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Today, Apache nations operate their own court systems with judges trained in both federal law and traditional dispute resolution. They run police forces whose officers speak Apache fluently and understand cultural contexts that outside law enforcement never grasped. They operate schools where children learn computer programming and Apache pronunciation with equal fluency. Modern Apache artists sell paintings for six-figure prices while their grandmothers' baskets enter museum collections worth millions of dollars. The same artistic traditions that once created functional survival equipment now create objects that collectors around the world recognize as masterpieces of indigenous art. The sacred mountains still echo with ancient prayers, but now those prayers are offered by young Apache who are training as doctors, lawyers, and engineers. Medical students who can recite traditional healing songs. Attorneys who understand both federal water rights law and the spiritual significance of specific springs and rivers. This is what survival looks like in the 21st century. Not the preservation of culture in museum displays, but the evolution of culture in living communities. Apache children grow up bilingual, not because federal policy requires it, but because their families choose it. They participate in traditional ceremonies, not because anthropologists document them, but because those ceremonies remain spiritually meaningful to contemporary Apache people. The burdened baskets that once held a family's entire material world now hold laptop computers, cell phones and college textbooks alongside traditional medicines and sacred items. The same containers, serving the same function, carrying everything necessary for survival in a challenging world. The people who once made Spanish viceroys and Mexican governors and American generals lose sleep have not vanished. They have not been defeated. They have not been assimilated into disappearance. They have done what they have always done, adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining the essential core of what makes them Apache. They have transformed without surrendering. They have modernized without abandoning their ancestors. And they have proven once and for all that some peoples cannot be conquered because they refuse to define themselves by anyone else's terms. They remain, as they have always been, simply the people, carrying tomorrow's hopes in burdened baskets woven from memory and determination, walking paths that connect ancient wisdom to future possibilities. The Apache story isn't over. It's just beginning a new chapter.